Hello, everybody. Welcome aboard. Lovely to see you all. Thank you. We've all gathered here tonight on a very important occasion to talk about the hostile takeover of the Calvary Hospital. This is a hospital in Canberra that has been the backbone of Canberra Health, has some 250 beds and was taken over by the government on Monday of this week. So we're concerned about the way this hospital was taken over and why it was taken over. And tonight you'll be hearing speakers speak about the background to that and the implications of that, and the fact that this is an extraordinary attack on religious freedom. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to get underway, and we have a number of important speakers tonight. The first is Michelle Pearce. Michelle is the Managing Director of the Australian Christian Lobby since May this year. She has an extensive background with the Australian Christian Lobby and in working as an advisor to a Member of Parliament. So we're pleased to have Michelle speaking to us tonight. Also, Jeremy Hanson will be speaking to us. He's the Leader of the Opposition here in the ACT Assembly and the member for Murrumbidgee. He's won 4 elections here in the ACT and currently the Leader of the Opposition.
For years, Canberra's health system has been in decline. Staff, health professionals and patients were all calling out for change. But what the government was planning in secret and how they've done it has shocked Canberra to its core. This is the story of the takeover of Calvary Hospital and the trampling of democracy in the ACT. For 44 years, Calvary have been providing healthcare to Canberra patients. In 2011, the government signed a new deal guaranteeing Calvary's place for 88 years. But late in 2022, the government stopped talking to Calvary. We now know why. On the 11th of May 2023, the Canberra community was blindsided when the ACT Greens Labor coalition government announced they would be forcibly acquiring Calvary Hospital, its land and its assets, ripping up their remaining contract and essentially forcing all of the Calvary staff to work for ACT Health. No warning, no consultation, just brutal execution. The legislation to make this happen was tabled in the Assembly without any notice and was rammed through without proper scrutiny on the next sitting day. The ACT government then moved a motion to ensure that the normal committee and parliamentary processes into this decision were removed. Calvary were given just a few weeks' notice to comply, and if they objected, the law gave the government the power to send in the police. It's caused enormous stress and concern for patients and staff. It's created outrage around the country. It's been raised in federal parliament. Yet despite the protests, the thousands of signatures, the repeated calls for proper process, the government is taking what they want and they will change the law to make the unthinkable legal. The question being raised now is, who is next?
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's great that so many of you have joined, because sometimes in the ACT we feel like we're battling alone here. So to have you all with us is just tremendous. Look, I might go through where we find ourselves and the journey that we've been on. But you may or may not be aware that here in the ACT we have a Labor Greens coalition government. They've been around for 21 years. And in many ways, they've been riding roughshod over this community, as is the case with any government that's been around, in our view, for too long. And in the ACT, you have a unicameral system, which means that we don't have an upper house. We don't have a Senate. So if they get the votes in the lower house, they can essentially do as they wish. And that's what's happened here. So just taking it back a bit, Calvary Public Hospital has been around, as you saw in the video, for about 44 years, and it was set up prior to self-government here in the ACT. It's a normal acute hospital, and it's been delivering very good services to the ACT for that time. And it is in many ways, the best performing part of what is a very dysfunctional health system here in the ACT. And just recently, and actually we called for a Royal Commission into the ACT health system that, for example, has the longest ED waiting times in Australia. So Calvary's been doing a great job. They've got a particularly good culture. A lot of staff want to work there. And there's been a previous attempt from the government to take Calvary over, but that sort of fell flat in about 2010. And in 2011, they signed a new contract for 88 years with Calvary to say, look, deliver these services to the ACT. And they've been in conversation with them recently because the government's plan, which we actually support, is to build a new hospital in the north of Canberra. Calvary, we think, should be running that, but that's a different view, obviously, to the ACT government. And in about November last year, those negotiations went very quiet. And what the government had been doing behind closed doors, in secret, nobody knew about it. They actually were planning a hostile takeover. And what they had is legislation that they tabled in the Assembly that, to be frank, was draconian. And they circumvented the processes of the Legislative Assembly. So normally what would happen is that as a piece of legislation is tabled, it would then go off to a committee and it would allow people to make submissions or there to be public hearings. There would then be a report and then that could be considered. But they circumvented that and they had this piece of legislation that said, in essence, give us everything you've got, give us your land, your assets, your people, your contracts, your patients, your records, everything. And you've got to do it by the 3rd of July. This is all happening in mid-May. Give it all by the 3rd of July. And if you don't, we have the right to call in the police and acquire it by force. Now, it's unprecedented. It's extraordinary. Calvary took this matter to court and unfortunately were unsuccessful in the ACT Supreme Court because the government essentially just wrote the law to make it legal. And I guess if you write the law to make something legal, you can do what you want now in the ACT. So we found ourselves in a position where this law has now passed, that the assembly processes of the Assembly have been circumvented, and it's appalled everybody, staff, nurses groups, doctors groups, the business chamber, the Interfaith Forum, the Archdiocese. I don't think there's anyone that thinks that this is a good thing. Even the ABC in their editorial said, look, whether you agree with what they're doing or not, we certainly don't, but there are some that do, the way that they've done it is pretty outrageous. And I think everybody is of that view. It's a trampling of democracy, it's bullying. And, it calls into question why they're doing it. And in my view, there is an anti-faith element to it, which is very disturbing. And I guess the other part is that they are a very left-wing socialist government and they just don't like an organisation that isn't a government organisation running a significant part of the health system. The question, the video you saw asked the question, who's next? And what we now know is that it's Claire Holland House. And because of the takeover of the hospital, it means that the little company Mary and Calvary Healthcare can no longer run Claire Holland House, which in the ACT is a very well regarded palliative care facility. So that's been taken over. And you've got to remember that this is all in the context of a government that is looking to bring in euthanasia laws. And the euthanasia laws that they're looking to bring in, although they haven't tabled the legislation, will be the most extreme in Australia. And they're talking about the ability to euthanize children as young as 14. And it's in that environment that this is all happening. So our colleagues on the Hill in Parliament House have observed this and are equally outraged. And Senator Matt Canavan has introduced a piece of legislation, which, to be frank, won't be successful, which is to call for an ACT inquiry. It's an amendment to the Self-Government Act, and that itself won't be successful. But what it has prompted is an inquiry into that piece of legislation. So it's a pretty clever process, which has actually enabled what we have now before us, which is an inquiry in the Senate into what's happened at Calvary. And I'm sad to say that it's not actually going to stop what has happened, but what it will allow is an airing, an ability for people in the ACT and elsewhere to put their views forward about what's happened. And we're hoping that there would be a broad range of people submitting. The ACT Labor and Greens coalition government isn't happy with what's happening. They see it and they characterise it as some sort of assault on territory rights. I see it very differently, and I see what the ACT government has done through its behaviour is actually an attack on the rights of ACT citizens. It's trampled over democracy. It's trampled over their rights. Certainly it's trampled over Calvary's rights. And this is really a mechanism to try and allow at least the issues to be presented and discussed, which have been denied to residents of the ACT. So if the ACT government had actually followed their own due processes, we wouldn't be in this position today. So, well, I thank you all for your interest in this. I thank you for, the support you're showing by attending this webinar and potentially making submissions to the inquiry. And we will continue to stand up for what I think are very important issues in the ACT and work with the Australian Christian Lobby on issues like drug decriminalisation, which the government has decriminalised heroin and meth in the ACT. And I think we share a view that that's a very bad thing. We share a view also on this terrible takeover of Calvary, not just what they've done, but how they've done it. So I'll leave it there, but I'd like to thank you all very much and for the ability to have a chat with you all this evening.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your time this evening to give us that explanation from your perspective. Very helpful for us all, and we're all in shock about what has happened. And just giving us further information really does then bring us to that position of more shock. And so thank you so much. And thank you to everyone here for coming along tonight and really showing concern for the government overreach into this area. A lot of people think, as the Australian Christian Lobby, as Christians, that we exaggerate, but because this does sound so bad, and it is the shock factor, and because we're shocked, we sometimes think, well, how could this be? This can't be true. But when you hear it laid out as such, you can make the own logical connections in your own mind to reach your own conclusions. And so we encourage you to do that tonight, just to hear these facts as Jeremy has presented, as I'm going to present to you tonight, and then really make up your own mind on it. And if you feel moved, at the end, we're going to provide an opportunity for you to actually form your submission, and we'll have time at the end for questions as well. But as a result of our analysis and involvement in this issue, we believe that the takeover of Calvary Hospital was ideologically driven because the ACT government can't accept a hospital who denies the provision of legal abortion and legal euthanasia. And so this evening, I'm going to run through a few points regarding why we think this is so. And I'll be speaking into the government's justification, why, what they said, and then what our view is on what they've said, the haste of the acquisition, which Jeremy touched on, the unaddressed community concerns, and lastly, the implications for our religious freedom, which I know many of you joining tonight are concerned about how this affects you. So firstly, how is the ACT government justifying this takeover? Well, in the words of the explanatory memorandum in the Health Infrastructure Enabling Act, which is the one we're doing the Senate inquiry, that Canada is doing the inquiry on, the objectives were connected to operational efficiency and delivering effective and accessible healthcare. And I'm sure you've heard those words repeated as you've heard the justification of this. So the question is, how was Calvary Hospital not operationally efficient or delivering effective and accessible healthcare? And in whose opinion were they not? Because the latest ACT Public Health Services quarterly performance report actually found that 93% of respondents to an inpatient survey reported a positive experience and were satisfied with the care at Calvary Hospital. And Calvary has been a trusted healthcare provider for the public ACT patients, as Jeremy mentioned, for 44 years. And the ACT government itself has affirmed the valuable role that Calvary has played in healthcare. So how is it not delivering effective and accessible healthcare? And the question is, could it be that the ACT defines effective and accessible as providing easy access to all health services, including abortion, and in the future, euthanasia as well? Is this, again, Christians, us taking our Christian angle, or does this actually have legitimacy? Well, here again are some facts. In April 2023, only 3 months before the hostile takeover, an ACT Legislative Assembly Committee report on abortion suggested, which was later amended, actually, conveniently, that Calvary's overriding religious ethos was problematic and the ACT government should address this. The report also contains an entire section about Calvary's conscientious objection and discuss concerns about equity of access, and there's that word access because accessibility was one of the issues, and reproductive justice. It recommended that Calvary Hospital provide full reproductive health services and made comments about societal punitive responses to abortion, referring to Calvary. The report determined that Calvary Hospital should provide full reproductive health care and that the ACT government should advocate on this. So another potential and probable link is the fact that, as Jeremy mentioned, one of the most radical euthanasia laws in Australia are expected to be introduced in the ACT Parliament in the second half of 2023. So would Calvary be efficient, effective, and an accessible healthcare provider if it didn't open the doors to euthanasia? And the government knows that Calvary is clearly at odds with the euthanasia agenda, because in Calvary's own website, it stated its response to the voluntary assisted dying legislation, aka euthanasia, and confirms its opposition. And they've made submissions opposing euthanasia to the ACT government, again in April this year. So Calvary is clearly out of step with the ACT government's views on euthanasia. And if they were to stay as Calvary, they would have withheld the government from implementing its euthanasia agenda, given that it would have become a key barrier to the universal ACT euthanasia rollout. And it's almost certain that objection to the coming euthanasia laws was relevant to the acquisition of Calvary. So this is the bottom line, just to tie it together. In April 2023, two things happened. One, Calvary Hospital sends a submission to the ACT government stating their opposition to euthanasia. Two, the Legislative Assembly Committee reports that Calvary should provide full reproductive health care and equity of access to abortion. Then, as early as the next month, the government introduces a bill to allow itself, with great haste, to take over Calvary Hospital. Then, less than 2 months later, Calvary is now in the hands of the ACT government and will no doubt in the near future allow access to abortion, and then, not long after, euthanasia. And more can be said as to the haste of this acquisition and its timeframes. See, the bill was first presented on the 11th of May, and then it was passed on the 31st of May, which is the very next sitting day. This is almost unheard of. The second reading speech of the bill being considered in the inquiry states that the bill was tabled without notice and pushed through without proper scrutiny. The government moved a motion to circumvent the normal committee inquiry process. And under the Act, the default acquisition day was set to 3rd of July, 2023, which was only 5 weeks later. And Calvary, of course, criticised this as an imposed, unrealistic timeframe that even risked clinical safety, but we're seeing it outplayed. Further to this, the Act did not specify how compensation to Calvary would be agreed or paid before the acquisition took place. And Calvary has stated that it had to bring a legal challenge because it did not expect that it could receive the just terms, in other words, the compensation based on the provisions in the Act. It wasn't laid out, it wasn't agreed upon. The same government, this is the issue, the same government that forced the takeover with great haste is the same government who makes the terms of that arrangement and terms of the compensation to Calvary. So there was no non-biased third party. The government set the rule and then benefited from the rule with no external scrutiny. And even before the acquisition, the government was able to enter the land and to begin the transition. Calvary had substantial obligations placed on them before and after the acquisition, and it's ongoing, despite not having received the compensation and the acquisition being quick and unexpected. And as Jeremy mentioned, the police officers were given the powers to ensure compliance if reasonably necessary. This is barbaric. And there are significant unaddressed community concerns, which I'm sure many of you are part of that community, regarding the lack of consultation. You know, usually for a decision that affects the community to this degree, a hospital, there would be an adequate consultation process. However, this decision to acquire the Calvary Hospital was made without consulting Calvary or the public. Furthermore, there was no inquiry by the Legislative Assembly prior to the government's announcement. So the Act bypassed the normal parliamentary committee and public submission process. As would be expected, by any reasonable person, there are, and as we have witnessed, huge community concerns. We've seen this play out, one of which was a Save Calvary petition that attracted over 48,500 signatures. And what gives further credibility that the government was ideologically targeting Calvary is the fact that there was other land options available. This wasn't the only way they could do it. There was ways they could do it without forcing a takeover and without forcing a bill through Parliament that allowed them to do this. But now as it stands, the ACT government does not have a conscience-driven hospital, which suits the ACT government's agenda, health agenda, well. So given all this, we have many reasons to question the legitimacy of the stated objectives in this bill that enabled the takeover, which is that of operational efficiency and delivering effective and accessible healthcare. The old Calvary Hospital would not provide access to legal abortion, and it would not provide access to upcoming euthanasia, perhaps leading the ACT government to the conclusion that Calvary does not provide accessible healthcare. So this has implications upon our religious freedom, massive implications, because if the acquisition was, as we think it was, linked to Calvary's pro-life views, then this would be an act by the government to seize an institution based on its religious views, and it would have significant implications upon our religious freedoms nationwide. So how does the government deem a faith-based institution to be effective, efficient, or accessible? You see, there are currently no protections in place to stop the government from deeming a religious institution that provides a public service as ineffective, inefficient, or inaccessible, and then taking it over because they deem it so, as they did in this case. For an ideologically driven government, wherever an organization doesn't align with their views, the same thing could happen. See, the issue is we as individuals, we have some protection of our rights, and that varies between states. But the issue is that institutions don't have that same protection, those same protections. So the conflict is that our freedom of religion is enjoyed collectively through institutions, not only as individuals. So we collectively come together as the church, or as a Christian school, or a Christian hospital, or a charity, and our freedom of religion is enjoyed or expressed through the institution. But the institution itself is not protected. And that's where governments can intrude on our freedom of conscience because we do not have the institutional protections. So this acquisition sets a dangerous precedent for future government takeovers of institutions whose religious beliefs are out of step with government views. And there are serious concerns that faith-based services in education, in aged care, could also be seized by governments, as well as, hospitals and churches, or anywhere where our freedom of religion is practiced, our conscientious objection is practiced. Does a Christian school, that teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman is the best model for family or rearing children, would they be considered inefficient or ineffective? Or does the fact that Christian schools preference faith-based applications make them inaccessible as determined by the government? Or do aged care homes who refuse a conversation with their residents regarding euthanasia be considered ineffective? This precedent puts all religious institutions at risk, and we should be concerned. So, we need to speak, we need to defend our Christian institutions, because in them, we enjoy the freedom to worship, to share our beliefs, and to be discipled according to the truth of the Word of God. You take away our churches, our schools, our hospitals, our charities, and that puts us in a very difficult position, and ultimately means that we are inhibited to do as we do as Christians, to outwork the mandate of Christ, which is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey Christ. So it's time for us to speak, to act, and this Senate inquiry gives us the opportunity to do that. And I just want to finish by a quote in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who says, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act."